So Linda, hi, nice to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Thank you for being here. First question, of course, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Linda Dishman, and I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy, which has the largest membership of any local preservation group in the country.
The Los Angeles Conservancy is actually a member-based non-profit organization. While I was preparing for this interview, I actually thought you were a public organization, but actually not. You're private. So how did it all start?
Well, it started when a building was threatened with demolition, as most preservation organizations are founded. And in our case, it was the Central Library in downtown Los Angeles, an amazing Goodhue building. And it was proposed for demolition with a high-rise built above, and then they would have the library on the lower floors. And a group of concerned citizens came together to try and find ways to save the library. Ultimately, there was a preservation plan that was adopted, that the library was preserved, and the air rights over the library were sold to a developer who then built two much taller buildings adjacent to the project. And then the funds that from purchasing the air rights actually paid for the restoration of the library and then expansion of the books, the area for the books. And what was important about that is it really formed our approach at the Conservancy to look for a win-win solution. So when a building is threatened, obviously we marshal our resources, but we bring a lot of problem solving to the situation and trying to find, okay, how can we save this building and still meet what the developer or the property owner wants to do with the site. So often we work on projects where there's density built around historic buildings.
Part of your mission, if I'm not wrong, it's also to educate the public on the importance of historic places. So I was wondering, in what ways do you achieve this goal?
Well, from the very beginning, education has been central to our mission. And education is very important because if people don't understand that we have historic buildings, then they don't know why they need to be preserved. And so we have done education activities almost from our very first year at the Conservancy. And we do a walking tour program that mainly focuses on downtown Los Angeles. About 10,000 people a year take those tours, which are predominantly on Saturdays, but also other days too. And we do some special tours a year that either have a theme or a neighborhood. And we really are focusing a lot of our efforts on talking about different neighborhoods in particular and the layers of history that happen in Los Angeles as different populations live in neighborhoods. And we do a lot of real outreach to people so that they understand that we have historic buildings, and doing this interview is another form of that educational outreach.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, a perfect approach. And of course, I can imagine over the years, the perception, hopefully, of Conservancy has changed, particularly in Los Angeles, I would say. So how that has changed?
Well, in Los Angeles, we had to get beyond the common perception that we didn't have a lot of historic buildings. And so I think we've made really good progress on that. But so there's the traditional buildings that people think are historic, and then the more recent past, and how do we feel about that? And so that has been something that we have worked through with really significant resources. And we had a volunteer group that started in 1984 that was initially called the 50s Task Force that then kind of morphed into ModCom, or the Modern Committee, that really kind of took on as their charge getting people excited about particularly the 50s and 60s, and then that's continued to grow as the recent past is getting more recent. Then this year we launched the 70s Turn 50. We couldn't find a better name. That's been a great experience too, although it's been a little circumvented with our activities and tours because of the pandemic. But it's been great to kind of see people understand why glass skin buildings are significant. We ask people questions. So we go to the building and say, how would you rate this building 1 through 5? And a lot of times people give it a 1 because they don't really like it. And then they hear all about the building. And then, we're inching into 3s and 4s and we get a couple 5s. So that really shows that education changes how people perceive things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that you do it, and there should be more and more organizations doing this. You already mentioned some buildings, but we keep on talking about buildings. What type of buildings do you focus on, and why?
We've done a lot of Googie. We've done a lot of Neutra buildings. It depends on what's threatened and what we see as sort of a group of buildings being threatened, and then we will focus our educational activities. So I mentioned for our 60s turn 50 that we had 3 60s buildings threatened. One of them was the Century Plaza Hotel, and a developer had purchased it. Initially said he was going to save it, and then decided not to. And so we launched this huge campaign to save it. It's really significant. 1966, Minoru Yamasaki, and who did the World Trade Towers, very important architect who also designed a lot of Century City. And you would talk to people like our supporters and say, this building is so significant, we have to save it. And they would say, really? It's historic? I remember when it was built. And so you think about Los Angeles, which is, so youth focused, and people didn't necessarily want to save a building that they saw built because it made them old. And so we had to kind of work past that a little bit and get people, you saw it being built and look at it now and it could go away. And what does that mean? And so we were able to really generate a lot of support, and we made it a campaign issue in a city council race. And that in Los Angeles, that's very critical in terms of saving buildings. And we also brought in the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have an 11 Most Endangered program. And that was sort of a turning point in people realizing, okay, if the National Trust says this 1960s building is significant, then it must be significant. And we'll go along with you on that. So, we always try and figure out what are the arguments and how do we counter the arguments. And so that was successful in that case.
Well, good job. and how do you, I was wondering actually while you were talking, how do you explain the difference between something old and something historic?
So not everything old is historic, but not everything historic is old. And so there's criteria for being designated. So there's also the lax use of historic, but most people use it in terms of it being designated. So all designation programs, which often have some protections, particularly at the local level associated with them, have criteria. So, was this done by an important architect? Is this an important architectural trend? Did something of historic significance happen there? Was this associated with a significant person or a group of people? So there is criteria. And I always get, irritated when people say, oh, you just think everything's historic. It's like, no, not really. And, we really do focus on criteria because we want to make sure that we're doing the legwork and the research to make sure that these buildings are significant. And that's really important. The city of Los Angeles just a few years ago completed Survey LA, which is the largest survey, at least in the United States and probably in the world. Less than 7% of the city is considered historic. So a lot of times when we're trying to save a building, people say, oh, you just want to save everything, and you're stopping development. We'll never be able to build housing that we really need. And it's sort of like, wait a minute here, 6% of the city is historic. So go build on the other 94% of the city, and there's plenty of room for you to do this. And I think that information is not out there, and so that's become a real focus for us to be able to talk about these buildings. And the thing that's important about that piece of that little fact is that most of the city of LA was built after World War II. More than half of the city was built after World War II. So that's becoming historic now. And we're still only saying, less than 7% of the city is considered historic. So that's the distinction between historic and old.
So we talked a lot about saving the buildings, but what happens after a building is saved?
Our goal is to get things designated because particularly at the local level, because if they're designated, then there is a public review process for changes to that building. And that's what really is necessary, is that it's just public, and that people can't just go in and pull a permit, or not pull a permit in many cases. In terms of demolition, the fines for tearing down a building without a permit are not very significant. And so people just kind of view that as the cost of doing business.
And as owner of a mid-century house with an historical value, why would you ask for help to the Conservancy?
Well, we do help a lot of property owners that want to save their houses. And we do a lot of work. Los Angeles has a program called, our historic districts are called HPOZs, or Historic Preservation Overlay Zones. And we have spent a lot of time through the years working with individual neighborhoods to become historic. And one reason that that's important is that it's not just about the individual house, it's how all the individual houses link together and really form a neighborhood. So landscaping becomes more important, how they, are there fences or they're not fences between, in the front yards, that kind of thing. And so there's currently 35 historic districts in Los Angeles, 2 of which are mid-century. So we have the Mar Vista tract, which was designed by Gregory Ain, with landscape by Garrett Ekbo. And so that's an HPOZ. And then our one and only Eichler tract in the city of Los Angeles in Balboa Highlands. So those were both exciting to get through the HPOZ process. And they both had really strong resident support within the neighborhoods to make them historic.
Yes, it is great that you work already with Eichler homeowners. Many of our readers own an Eichler house, and they often tell us how important it is for them not only to preserve their home, but also their neighborhood, because the neighborhood is part of their home. So I think it's great that you already work with some of them. And moving forward, some might struggle to make sense of preservation efforts. Would you like to tell us why instead it is important to preserve architecture?
Buildings tell the stories of our cities, our history. But it's not just the history of the city per se, it's really the history of the people. And so you look at the Balboa Highlands tract, it talks about Eichler, how he had a vision for neighborhoods that he then was able to build. And they are one of the most successful, subdivisions in terms of, California and where people want to live in terms of mid-century modern. We have a lot of work by Palmer and Kreisel, very well in Palm Springs, but they did a lot of work in Los Angeles. So it's telling the stories of sort of the development of that. And then it also it's about there's better sustainability of reusing and keeping the buildings that we have, rather than, okay, it's been 25 years, let's just demolish this and let's build something new. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is that everybody's like, oh, we want to tear this down and build an energy efficient house. And it's like, well, there's so much embodied energy in that house, so it could take you 50, 60 years to get that energy savings, so that you can have a clean conscience that you've done the right thing. So we really think part of this is about having a livable city. We did a study this last year that we call Preservation Positive, that looks at sort of where people want to live, and historic districts or older neighborhoods have more tree canopy, which is really essential, particularly in a hot climate like Los Angeles, to help keep the temperatures down. They have greater walkability. They tend to be more oriented to transit, partly because they're just along old transit lines. But there's just a lot of factors that make these neighborhoods a very significant role in the livability of our cities.
So far we talked a lot about Los Angeles, of course, but Los Angeles is in California. And what do you think it is unique about Californian architecture?
A lot of innovative architects and craftspeople worked here. And I think, not that other cities and places don't have that, but there was a pretty heady concentration of them here. And a lot of them work together on projects. And so you see that in Pasadena with Green and Green, but then bringing in all of these, glass artisans and carpenters and, creating these masterpieces that kind of spread throughout the community and then ultimately, far and wide around the world. And so that's exciting. I mean, so you see, kind of that collaborative process and sort of what that becomes. And all these architects were friends and had Sunday dinners and all of that, sometimes married one another. So it really is, there's a social component to this as well as a design component. And I think that while there certainly were architects that did not collaborate a lot, but I think that part of that is sort of the Southern California tradition. I think that there's just been a tradition of orienting architecture to the environment, and that goes way back. That wasn't discovered in mid-century. That goes back into the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, and with the craftsman work. And so it wasn't just about transplanting Victorian architecture from the East Coast or classical revival. It was about how do you integrate indoors and outdoors here, because we have such amazing weather. And so we can do that. When you're on the East Coast where you don't have good weather all the time, you have to be more protective about how do you, insulate yourself from the cold. So
Yes.
The climate, I think, had a huge impact on the types of architecture that you see in Southern California in particular.
Over the years, you have saved many buildings, but what are the projects you have worked on in the past that you are the most proud of?
We have been successful at saving a lot of buildings, and a part of that is because we really bring a lot of people together in terms of that effort. One of the projects that really sticks in my mind as being truly difficult was the oldest McDonald's, which is in Downey. So this was the third McDonald's ever built, and it was built to early franchisor, and they operated it for many, many years and made a good living and sent their children to college, and their children didn't want to take over the franchise. So it was ultimately sold back to McDonald's. And McDonald's, it turns out, really hated this franchise because they didn't have to pay any of the marketing fees, and which are substantial if you own a McDonald's, and because it predated, so they had it in for this building. And so when they purchased it, they decided they were going to close it. And they actually built another McDonald's about a mile away to try and shut it down, to say it wasn't doing very well. And so they proposed tearing it down. And the city of Downey was outraged. The city of Downey still does not have a preservation ordinance, but this was the building that they were going to save, and they did. And so it started with McDonald's saying, we're going to tear this down, the city saying no, but they didn't have a preservation ordinance. And then the Northridge earthquake happened. And so the McDonald's said that the earthquake caused damage to the building and they had to tear it down. And there's a state law that says you have to actually demonstrate that there's structural damage before you tear a building down. You can't just willy-nilly tear buildings down in the aftermath of an earthquake by saying that they're damaged. And so that McDonald's wasn't able to get a permit to tear it down. So the city was able to hold off on issuing the permit. And so our modern committee, who very creative, very enthusiastic, did several rallies with the city of Downey. It got on national news, and so that really made McDonald's angry. And so it was really difficult for us to do our traditional reaching out and working with them because they were really angry with us. And we never thought it would get on national news. And so we kept trying, and we got the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They named it an 11 most endangered. And so they started reaching out to McDonald's, and McDonald's wasn't really mad at them. They were just mad at us. And so we were able to kind of keep that conversation going. And, part of the strategy in preservation is trying to keep buildings up long enough for something to happen so that there's like a little bit of luck. And, in this case, it was keeping it up long enough for this earthquake ordinance to trigger. But in this case, too, McDonald's was being very stubborn, and we weren't able to get any traction. And then it turned out the person that we were dealing with at McDonald's, one of the regional vice presidents, left McDonald's because he'd been embezzling money. And so he left, and we got a new person in as the regional vice president. And he had started his McDonald's career at a McDonald's that looked just like Downey McDonald's.
Bingo.
And so he had affection for the building. And he decided that this would be an amazing thing for McDonald's to do, to restore this. And so under his leadership, it was restored. And they have a little museum, and it's amazing.
It's very interesting, this point of view of buildings connecting to people's maybe childhood and personal history, and use that as a trigger to let them understand how important the history of our buildings is, like you mentioned before, and also this gets close to your feelings and your emotions, which is always a good trigger to use in these cases. And talking about emotions, what is the project you are currently working on that is instead closer to your heart right now?
We're really working on legacy businesses, because as real estate values get astronomical in Los Angeles, a lot of these businesses are not able to sustain themselves, and so they're going away. And these are the businesses that, like, where you are, because this is where you go eat on a Thursday night, or this is where you go to the deli to get, you've been going every Saturday for sandwiches or whatever. I mean, these are kind of integral places of our lives. Sometimes they're not integral, but they're still beloved. People say, I can't believe this place closed. It's like, well, how many times did you eat there? Oh, maybe once a year. It's like, well, it's hard to stay in business if people only eat there once a year. So our goal is really to really promote them so that people know how special they are, because as long as they're being patronized, they're likely going to stay in business. It may be a different owner, but somebody else will come in and take over a successful business. And that is one of the issues facing legacy businesses, is that a lot of them were created in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and now there's just generational change. And so that is something that, we need to be aware of. But it's been really heartwarming to work with the owners of these buildings, and to see how grateful they are that other people appreciate what this restaurant is, or what this dry cleaners has provided, or this nursery, and buying plants. And so as part of the pandemic, we've really been promoting legacy businesses, because all restaurants are hurting right now. And just making sure that people know that these legacy businesses are probably on an even slender thread than some other businesses, and to really promote getting takeout, and maybe buying meals for people in ICU, the staff there, just to really kind of keep these businesses going, as well as help other people during the pandemic. But it's so important, because preservation often is seen, and I think it has been true historically, is we're all about buildings. And a lot of what we do at the Conservancy is talk about people's relationships with the buildings, and that is where the power comes. Because if once people understand that these buildings are important, then they will be part of the effort to save them.
Yes, the public is an essential part of this process, right? And talking about the public, this is difficult time. You mentioned already the pandemic a couple of times, of course, how that is impacting the businesses that you are trying to help. But how the public is helping you in this difficult moment, and how is it supporting you and the organization?
One of the things that I think has been really successful and has really been popular is we really pivoted to doing online education and engagement. And it was a real shift for our organization. We had a lively presence, on social media and e-news and everything, but this was just like how do we do virtual tours, and how do we engage people so they can't go out, but they still want to see something. And so, we have all this information, and so how do we package it in a way that people are going to spend 20 minutes looking at a virtual tour of Millard Sheets, architecture and art. And we've had great success with it. It's been really amazing to see people's comments, and there's stuff I never learned, or I've driven by that building for years, I never knew the history. And so it's been a different way to reach people. I have to say that, in a perfect world, we still would take people out to actually touch buildings, because I think that's where the real conversion experience is. And we are a place-based organization, but if that's not possible, then we can pivot. and people have responded, and I think that it translates, even though it's not the same experience, but it translates into greater knowledge of the historic and architectural and cultural resources that we have.
Plus, you can reach way more people that you can in presence. So people from Australia or Europe or anywhere else in the world can actually join your tours. Are you gonna keep them, all these online initiatives afterwards?
I think we've seen the value of doing virtual tours in our reach, and so I think we will absolutely keep that as one of our tools in outreach. But I think we also will be spending some resources on just going out with people to see things and be in the streets.
Absolutely. I think we all need that. We need to get out and touch things and one another. Linda, thank you very much. The time, unfortunately, is up, but I want to thank you again for your time. And it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.